Hello, bonjour, Annie. Welcome to our second Bluecoat Talk. This time we are live. Bluecoat Talks are a new initiative from Science North to continue engaging you with science, technology, engineering, and math at a distance. And you know who's good at all of those things and being at a distance? Astronauts. Joining me today is astronaut Dr. Dave Williams. He worked for the Canadian Space Agency. He also worked for NASA as the director of their Space and Life Sciences Directorate, and he is currently the CEO of a private sector biotech company called Leap Biosystems, focusing on augmented reality solutions for remote or virtual medical care. He has also written Defying Limits, which is an adult book, but he's also written 4 educational and inspiring books for children. Hello, Dave. Thank you for taking the time to join us today from Mission Control.
Well, it looks like Mission Control. In fact, this is the old Mission Control, and it would be found in Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. I'm actually not there right now, but through the magic of modern technology, it looks like I'm there. And the fun part about this is I could just as easily be aboard the International Space Station, except there I'd be floating around and being able to answer questions from space. It's pretty exciting being able to do that.
It is really great technology. Also, because it allows our audience to participate in this interview today. So those of you who are watching right now, if you have questions for Dave, go ahead and enter them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that feed and ask him his questions in between the questions I'm asking. Okay, so first off, I'd like to know, in your children's book, Go for Liftoff, How to Train Like an Astronaut, you talk about expeditionary behavior. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how we can apply it to our everyday lives?
You know, over the course of sending humans into space, we learned one of the most important factors is how we interact with each other, the teamsmanship we bring, the leadership skills that we have, our followership skills, etc. And all of that is called expeditionary behavior. Essentially, it's how we work together, how we get along together. And whether you're traveling in space or actually whether you're isolated at home right now, the behaviors and the things that we do are pretty similar. In fact, one of the things that we find works really well in space is if there's a job that needs to get done, you just simply do it. It doesn't matter whose responsibility it was. We do have timelines and everybody's got activities, but sometimes if somebody falls behind in the timeline, they need a little bit of help. And being there for them, being there for the team is something that's as important in space as it is right now on the ground.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to go to our chat and take our first question. This one is from Jane Ann Sorensen. And if you are giving us questions, please, feel free to include your name and your age if you like. So she would like to know if you can tell us something about delamination of fingernails in space, and if that has anything that might have to do with our fingernails in regular gravity. She's wondering because hers keep breaking.
You know, it's an interesting question. And to answer the question, we need to start thinking about what our fingernails are like. So normally, our fingernails are layers of tissue on top of each other. It's a very hard tissue, but it's basically a set of layers of tissue, one on top of one another. And those tissues can separate from each other. Those layers can separate, they delaminate. And the reason why we have this problem in space when we're doing spacewalks is, of course, our hands are inside the glove of the space suit. And that glove is pressurized. So the natural position of your hands when you're doing a spacewalk is to have your fingers fully extended in front of you. And it takes strength to be able to curl your fingers down, to flex your fingers, to hold a tool, perform a task, or do whatever you have to do. But you know, your fingers are inside those gloves. And the challenge is when you put your fingers inside the glove and you're pulling your fingers down, you're flexing your fingers against the resistance of the glove, your fingernail gets pulled in the opposite direction by the inside of the glove. And you know, that sounds kind of painful. It's actually not that painful, but your fingernail gets lifted up off the nail bed. And the continuous friction of flexing your fingers over the course of a 6-hour spacewalk and training when you're getting ready to go in space causes those layers of your fingernail to separate or delaminate. So we use nail hardener before we go and do a spacewalk. That tends to help, and it tends to minimize the problem that we have. The other thing is we tend to cut our fingernails really, really short so they don't drag on the inside of the glove and cause that force that leads to the separation of the different layers of the fingernail.
Very cool. And of course, the good news for Jane right now is that we all want to be keeping our fingernails really, really short, right? Because that helps keep our hands nice and clean. So,
and keep them away from your face.
Yes, that too. I'd just like to give a shout out to Zachary, who just signed on, and also to a friend of mine, Kale Peterson, age 9. He'd like to ask, have you been to Mars?
I have not been to Mars, and we have not sent humans to Mars yet. We're hoping to be able to do that sometime, maybe in the next 20 years or so. I would love to go to Mars. I think it's absolutely incredible. The movie The Martian that many of us have seen is a really interesting movie. Of course, it's fictional. We have not done that yet, but it's kind of compelling and makes us wonder, what would it be like if we were living on the surface of Mars? And goodness gracious, we wouldn't want to be stuck on the surface of Mars in a catastrophic scenario like they saw in the movie The Martian. But I think just going there is going to be an amazing mission. Roughly 6 months to get there, 1 Mars year, which is 2 Earth years, and then another roughly 6 months to get back. So all told, it could be about a 3-year mission. Absolutely amazing.
Wow. Also one of my favorite movies. So you're quite active on social media. And a couple weeks ago, you tweeted, "When the going gets tough, it's time to innovate." From your perspective, what drives innovation in Canada, and how do you foresee us contributing to the global space program in the coming decades?
You know, it's very interesting looking at what drives innovation. And of course, many different things contribute to innovation. Right now, with this pandemic we're facing, there's a huge amount of innovation going on. It's a tough time, so people are trying to find solutions. And that really is what space exploration is all about. As we go forward and explore space, we need technologies to be able to do that. We have to develop and sometimes invent these new technologies to be able to travel farther in space and stay longer. So the requirements of space exploration drive the development of new technology. And what's so exciting to see in Canada, of course, is we are a major spacefaring nation. And the icon of Canadian space technology is the Canadarm, which we have on board the International Space Station. I was so lucky to be able to do 3 spacewalks and spend the majority of my second spacewalk riding on the end of the Canadarm. Really proud moment, as you can imagine, with the Canadian flag on my shoulder, riding on this icon of Canadian space technology. It was pretty amazing.
Wow, that is awesome. Okay, we have a question from Zachary, who is 6 years old, and he'd like to know how long it takes to get to the moon.
Hey, Zachary, that's a great question. So going to space takes 8.5 minutes. That's unbelievable. We lift off from Earth, 8.5 minutes later, we're in space, but the journey just begins. In the case of going to the space station, we have to rendezvous and dock with the space station. And usually these days we do that on the same day. So later in the day, 6 hours after liftoff, give or take a bit, we're rendezvousing and docking with the space station. Going to the moon, that's going to take us roughly 3 days. And it depends when we start. If we start on the same day we lift off, or if we start on the next day. But it's going to take us roughly 3 days to be able to get to the moon. And of course, as we just mentioned, going to Mars is going to take months. So there's a huge opportunity to develop new propulsion systems for rockets to be able to take us places faster. And maybe that's something that you'll do. Maybe you'll become an aerospace engineer, or maybe someone else watching this today will be inventing those rockets for the future, those propulsion systems that will enable us to go farther a lot faster than we do today.
And that brings up something else that's interesting, which is, what other kinds of jobs are there in the space sector for Canadians besides being an astronaut?
There's so many different jobs. I was really lucky to be able to have my dream come true and be able to fly in space as a Canadian astronaut. I dreamt about that when I was 7 years old. So perhaps somebody watching today will be the next generation of Canadian astronaut that might walk on the surface of the moon or go to Mars. And, you know, if you think that's not possible, remember, I was told that when I was a kid, so you never really know how things work out. But there's a whole host of other jobs, which is really cool. You can study planetary science. So you can be an astronomer. You can actually be an astrobiologist focusing on the potential for life on other planetary bodies in our solar system. And on Earth, we have bacteria that live in really extreme, harsh environments, in volcanoes at the bottom of the ocean. They're called extremophiles, and astrobiologists wonder whether or not life may exist somewhere in our solar system. So you could be an astrobiologist, you could be an astrophysicist, you could be an aerospace engineer. And in fact, if you look at all the breadth of different sciences and engineering specialties, pretty well all of them have some space application. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to focus solely on space. I know a number of Canadian life scientists who are studying how the heart works or how the brain functions, and they're doing that in a wide range of different populations, but they're also doing it on astronauts as well. So basically, any area of science, technology, engineering, math can actually have its application in space. And we don't want to forget about the arts, because one of the most important elements of exploring space is capturing amazing images of space, writing about the experience to share that with others on Earth.
Absolutely. Okay, we have another question from the audience. This is from Zach Bennett, age 3, and he would like to know how heavy your spacesuit is.
So on Earth, with me and my spacesuit and the tools and everything else, it could be 200 kilograms or so. It's pretty heavy. And, you know, it's because on Earth we, of course, have gravity, but in space, we no longer experience the force of gravity. We're floating around in what we call zero G or microgravity, but the suit still feels heavy. It has something called mass, and that's the property of articles that we possess working in space. So I feel like I'm still fairly heavy when I'm moving around. And the funny part about doing a spacewalk is if you're doing a spacewalk, it's like ice skating for the first time. It's really easy to get going and really hard to stop. So that's why we train and train for years before we go do these spacewalks, to learn how to move gracefully in that microgravity environment of space, where being in this large, heavy spacesuit really doesn't make any difference at all. And you know, it's really amazing. On my second spacewalk, I had to install a gyroscope on the space station. This gyroscope, it probably weighed, close to 650 kilograms. And I'm holding it in 2 hands, swinging it around. It almost would be like going to a hockey game, going on the ice, grabbing the Zamboni machine and swinging it around. You know, it's absolutely amazing what you can do in space.
Wow. Okay, Satu, age 7, loves space and would like to know when you got interested in space.
So I was 7 years old when I first started dreaming about becoming an astronaut, and that was a long time ago. It was in 1961, so you guys can figure out how old I am now. You can do the math. But it was probably around 11 days before my 7th birthday, and I watched Alan Shepard lift off to go into space. And in those days, we didn't have color TVs. We didn't have the technology like we have now. There was no internet or anything like that. I watched this on a really small black and white television. The images were really grainy and you could barely see what was going on, but I was mesmerized. I thought, that is amazing. When I grow up, I want to be able to do that. And of course, at that time period, that was the first of many space flights that took place in the decade of the 1960s. But we also had television shows. Things like Star Trek were on television. And the great part about that is, in the space program, we like to say we make science fiction into science fact. So I was watching those at the same time, and the dream of exploring space was very much alive for me.
So what do children and youth today need to do if they want to work in the space sector?
You know, first of all, there's a lot of opportunities in the space sector. And as I mentioned in my second book, Go for Liftoff, don't let other people define your dreams for you. Find something that you're really, really passionate about. understand that your passions and interests change over time. I mean, I started out my career as a neuroscientist, then I became an emergency physician, then I was an astronaut where my dream came true and I could do everything. I could do research and be a doctor in space, became an aquanaut, lived underwater. And then when I retired from that, I became a hospital CEO, back to being a doctor again. So things do change over time. But what I've learned is that pursuing my dreams, anything that's really worth doing, takes a lot of work. And it's hard sometimes. And I didn't always succeed. What I learned is it's what you do when you don't succeed that determines whether you will succeed. So much of this is captured in a phrase we call the astronaut attitude. And astronauts, by the way, have this lifetime love of learning. And I describe all of that in my second book, Go for Liftoff, How to Train Like an Astronaut. The first book, To Burp or Not to Burp, very important question in space, by the way, is all about how your body adapts to being in space. And it's kind of cool.
Okay, Gavin Leduc, age 8, would like to know if rocket ships are powered by fuel and if there's any chance they can run on hydrogen one day.
So the current design for rocket engines, some of them use liquid propulsion, some of them use solid propellants. Like the space shuttle, we were using liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and then the solid rocket boosters were a solid propellant. So there's a whole range of different potential models for developing an engine and different sources of fuel for those engines. So people are also looking at the possibility of nuclear engines for spacecraft, ion propulsion systems for spacecraft. So there's a whole host of development going on that you can read about. We talk a little bit about that in Mighty Mission Machines, my third book. But what I think is really exciting is one of you could very easily develop that next generation of spacecraft. And that's going to be really exciting because that'll help us go farther in our own solar system and be able to shorten the time it takes to go from one place to another.
Okay, going back to that burping, one of our audience would like to know, what is the difference between burping in space and on Earth?
Oh my goodness. All right. So here's the deal. On Earth, when we swallow, sometimes some air goes down, or if we're drinking soda pop or something, it's got fizzy bubbles in it. When we drink that down, it all goes to our stomach. And over time, because we live in a gravitational world, and generally speaking, we're standing up or we're sitting, what happens is all the liquid in your stomach and your food sort of goes to the bottom and the air goes to the top. It separates. So if your stomach gets a little stretched and you feel like you need to burp, what happens is air comes up. And you know, I'm sure you guys have figured out you can make some really interesting sounds. And of course, all the parents that are watching this are going, oh my goodness, don't tell them that. But you know, parents, we say, hey, don't do that at the table and say, excuse me afterwards. But what happens in space? Well, the big difference, of course, in space is there's no gravity. So all the liquid and food that normally goes to the bottom of your stomach, it's not at the bottom anymore. It's all mixed up inside your stomach. You still feel like you may have to burp because your stomach sometimes stretches. And if you do burp, it could be air that comes up, in which case you're really lucky, or it could be your turkey tetrazzini that you just had for lunch. So what do you do then? Well, the easiest thing, to be quite pragmatic, you just swallow it back down. It's not a big deal. I know it sounds really gross, but anyway, it's just sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
The price to pay when you're an astronaut. So I'm curious, can you tell us a bit about the resources and opportunities that the Canadian Space Agency is providing for children and youth right now?
There are a lot of resources available today that were never around. Even when I applied to becoming an astronaut in 1992, the resources that we had were pretty limited. And of course, we didn't have the internet in those days. But right now, the Canadian Space Agency, we're really excited. We have a program called Young Astronauts. And you can go to the Canadian Space Agency website. There's a whole lot of material that you can download. There's photographs that you can look at for teachers. There's educational content that you can teach in the classroom. It's just a really, really exciting opportunity. And in 1992, when I applied, there were a whole lot of people that applied. They only picked 4 of us, but there were over 5,000 applications. The reason why I'm telling you this story is 600 applications came from kids less than 10 years of age. That's amazing. And what we want to be able to do is give kids who are interested in space the resources that they need, the resources they're looking for to help them learn more about space. So you can go to the Canadian Space Agency website, check out the Young Astronaut program. It's out of this world.
And I did actually read that the deadline for applying for junior astronauts has been extended to the end of April. So if anyone out there is interested in going to an astronaut camp, we'll see how things go, but they are hoping to run one this summer, all expenses paid with Canadian astronauts. So definitely check that out. All right, so in your children's book, Destination Space, you talk about humans living on other planets. Will humans have to leave the planet Earth?
You know, it's an interesting question, and that's one of the reasons why we wrote the book. I personally believe that the human species is a spacefaring species, that it's part of our destiny to go to space. And of course, in the future, when we go to space, we're going to be staying there longer, and we'll probably be traveling farther within our own solar system. If you think about where we are in the context of cosmic time, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But you think 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, where will we be in terms of our ability to explore space? And of course, it's almost impossible to imagine how far we're going to be able to travel in space over the next 100 years, let alone the next 500 years and things. But one of the things that I love talking about, everybody asks, have you seen an alien when you've been in space? I have not seen an alien, but I am from the planet Earth. So when I go to space, I'm actually the alien. So if I'm on the surface of the moon or if I'm on the surface of Mars, I'm not from Mars, I'm from the Earth. So on the surface of Mars, humans become the aliens by definition. And that's kind of interesting when we think about the possibility of living on other planets in our solar system. I think the first one that we're really going to focus on is Mars. And we will probably do that in the next 50 years. And we'll do it the same way we've done with the International Space Station, where we've had humans permanently in space since the year 2000. We'll be essentially rotating crews through a habitat on the surface of Mars. So there'll be a permanent human presence on Mars. And then in the future, who knows what's going to happen? Will we stay there forever? Will we colonize Mars? Will we spread into different areas? We don't know. And some people say, why are we doing this? Well, there's many scientific reasons that we should do this, looking for the possibility of life that once existed elsewhere in our solar system. We don't know if this is true or not, so we need to send researchers out. We're sending rovers out, but we need to send astronauts with the rovers to search for life that may have once existed. You may wonder, why is that important? Well, if it once existed, then we need to try and understand why it no longer exists, because that information may be relevant for our own planet. And then there's some people that talk about the terrestrial imperative, some big reason that we have to explore space and potentially live on other planets. And you know, people have talked about asteroids and things like that. Right now we're in the midst of a pandemic, but I do believe, independent of all those other reasons, it's just the human nature to explore and be curious and want to discover. And I think over time, humans will travel farther in space, and it's going to be really exciting to see this happen in the lifetime of many of the people that are watching this right now.
Well, and along that idea, Satu, age 7, has another question. Can we grow plants in space?
Yes, we can. In fact, on board the International Space Station, if we were inside the space station right now, it's pretty similar to being at home. The temperature is about the same, the pressure is the same, the air composition is made up of oxygen and nitrogen. It's the same as what it is on Earth. The only difference is there's no gravity. But on board the International Space Station, a really good friend of mine, Scott Kelly, who is the commander for our STS-118 mission, Scott lived in space for a year, and they were growing flowers in space. In fact, he's got some really great photos of the flower that he was growing from space. They've been growing lettuce in space. So we're learning about this on the International Space Station to get ready to send humans back to the moon. And on the moon, we'll probably have a lunar greenhouse, which is absolutely incredible. Maybe we'll be growing tomatoes. And of course, the Canadian Space Agency has a tomato sphere project. Check it out. It's really cool. And you know, you can compare the rate of growth of tomato seeds that have been flown in space with the seeds that haven't flown in space. But, you know, we do some underwater missions, and we actually took tomato seeds and we tried to grow them underwater. Why? Because we can. And we found that the deeper you go, it's a little bit harder because the sun's light doesn't get through the water very well. You know, you can grow crops underwater at a depth of 5 feet, not a problem at all. But if you're down around 30 feet, it's cold and it's dark, and the ultraviolet rays, they just don't penetrate that way. So it's hard for that process called photosynthesis that's important for plants to grow. But fantastic question. And I look forward to having a chance to eat some lettuce that was grown in space. That would be pretty cool. Imagine what the packaging says, growing aboard the International Space Station. I think that's pretty amazing.
I really enjoyed that question too, because of course that was my PhD research. And the Canadian Space Agency also has a greenhouse on Devon Island in the high Arctic, where they're doing research on how to grow plants in space. So really important. So Pascal, who's 12, bringing it back to the human body, I'm glad you're a doctor, would like to know if you can get hiccups in space.
Yeah, you can. And you know, if you're hiccuping in space, it's the way in which you're going to hiccup is basically the same. The question is, what are you going to be doing? Are you floating all over the place while you're hiccuping or what? It's not that common that you get hiccups in space. In fact, I personally have never had hiccups when I'm in space, but it is possible to get hiccups in space. On my first space flight, we studied something a little bit different, but it was snoring. Can you snore in space? And we wonder about that because on Earth, you know, you snore because when you're asleep, all the tissues around your mouth and your tongue, they relax and your tongue falls back in the back of your throat. And when the air goes by it, it makes a funny sound called snoring. Well, in space without gravity, what happens? And for 99.9% of the people, they stop snoring in space. But there are these people that are really loud snorers on Earth. They actually still snore in space.
Okay. All right. So we have time for about 2 more questions. The Kiven and Newman family would like to know if you could choose the next place in the solar system to explore, where would you choose?
So I would love to go to Mars, and I think the pathway to Mars is via the moon. So right now we currently have humans on board the International Space Station in low Earth orbit. And we talk about the path to exploring space. I'm very proud to have had a couple of footsteps on that path, but everybody involved in the space program, whether you're in space as an astronaut or whether you're part of the team of thousands and thousands of people supporting these missions, we all have contributed to the journey on that pathway. And I think that pathway is going to take us back to the moon, hopefully by 2025, 2028, 2030, around there. And we'll be setting up habitats on the surface of the moon to continue to do scientific discovery research, but also to learn how to live for a longer period of time on the surface of the moon. What kind of rovers are we going to be using? Will we use the rovers like in the Apollo program where you ride on the rover? Or will we develop rovers that are like a Winnebago that you ride in the rover? So, you know, you're inside something, you don't need a spacesuit, you can drive around. And if you want to go outside, you climb into your spacesuit and away you go and you go for a walk. So just learning about habitats, learning about life support systems, growing plants on the moon, learning about rovers and things, that will get us ready to go to Mars. And I think Mars is going to be really exciting. It is far away, but it's not as far away as other destinations in our solar system. And of course, you know, going inwards in our solar system to Mercury or Venus, Venus is pretty much non-inhabitable, just simply by virtue of the temperature on the surface of Venus and how difficult it would be, even having rovers surviving on the surface of Venus is a really significant technical challenge. So I don't think we're going to go inward towards the sun. We will go outward, and the most logical place to go would be Mars. And I think those missions are going to be really exciting.
For sure. Okay, I have one last question.
I'm Clark, I'm 12 years old, and I'm wondering if you think there will be orbital hotels open to the public in my lifetime.
Well, that's a great question. And I think, will they be open and can you afford to go there? You know, this it's going to be an interesting situation. So Axiom Aerospace in the United States is actually talking about beginning to use the International Space Station to enable private sector astronauts, because any human that goes into space is an astronaut by definition. But these individuals are not going to be career astronauts. They're not going to be government astronauts like I was and things. But Axiom Aerospace is actually planning on beginning to utilize parts of the International Space Station for exactly that purpose. And you wonder, you know, what happens at the end of the time that the governments are using the International Space Station? Will we keep it in space? Who will do that? And could we turn it into like a really huge hotel? And could people go up and visit the International Space Station? So I would say the dream of doing that is very much alive, and it could very well become a reality in your lifetime. It's going to be expensive to start with, but hopefully we'll be able to get the prices down with the next generation of launch vehicles and things. The other part that I think is kind of interesting, we always talk about space. What about living underwater? I've lived on Aquarius, the world's only undersea research habitat, an amazing experience. Maybe one day we're going to have hotels underwater as well as hotels in space, and that would be pretty exciting.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Dave, for taking the time to talk with us today, for answering our audience questions. I am sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Maybe you can ask Dave on Twitter at AstroDaveMD. And this has just been an amazing experience. I am definitely going to read Defying Limits, Lessons from the Edge of the Universe. And I hope our audience is inspired to keep reading, keep learning, and to keep being the best they can be.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a real thrill being able to share stories of exploring space. And I love the questions. The questions are just fantastic. And there are many of the same questions that I had when I was learning about the space program as well. So it's so exciting being able to share the message. I hope you enjoy the books. And if you want to do another one of these at any point in time, don't hesitate. Just send me an email. We'll see if we can figure out a way to do another one. But thanks so much for having me today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. All right, everyone, keep looking up. Bye for now.